Discoverer. What? Okay. Hello guys. So today's topic is about NodeJS. We finally moved to the backend module, right? And the first topic of the backend module will be introduction to NodeJS. And you may wonder what is NodeJS, right? So don't worry, even though the name looks so, it's kind of like very familiar to you, right? But in fact, we already used it before, right? When we create a React app, we actually use Node.js. When we do npm style, npm install, those commands are actually from Node.js as well. So we actually used it before, but we didn't know. Okay. So here are the three main things that we need to, like, the three concepts that we need to wrap today. First is that we need to differentiate between the front end and the back end side. Sorry, I need to see my face. I don't know if I'm talking to myself or what. Okay. Oh, I didn't share my screen. Okay. Am I recording? Okay. So here are the three main things that we need to learn today. Differentiation between front end and the back end side, right? Then we learn a little bit of the syntax of Node.js. And finally, at the end of the day, you need to understand what we can do with Node.js and what we cannot do. Okay. So here's a little a couple of picture to describe front end and back end. Okay. So this picture actually speak a lot, but let's talk about it later in the next slides. So here's a meme. Oh my God, Alexa is speaking. Scare the shit out of me. Okay, here's the front end and here's the back end. So usually, sorry, I need to turn up Alexa. Okay, the front end, usually people will build a very good, beautiful front end. But in fact, on the back end side, it's very shitty, you know. There's a lot of bugs and error or like kind of like bugs that can be bypassed by using Postman, for example. And I actually prefer a beautiful front end, back end rather than a beautiful front end because I'm very bad at UI UX, even though the logic is good, but my UI UX is very bad. So this is me. I like back end more. So what's front end and what's back end? On the front end side, like the last 6 weeks, we focus a lot on how things works. How things looks, right? So, and interaction between the user and the web page. That's the front end, and we use a lot of. We only use 3 languages, which are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? Remember, React is just a framework for JavaScript. It's not a language. So we only use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's it. For the front end, we use those 3 languages to manipulate the images, the content, the structure of the site, the route of the site, right? So we use React Router to manage the route or the structure, and we use component to manage the structure of our application. So that's all for front end. We only use 3 languages: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In the future, you may use Dart or Flutter, which is another language for front end developed by Google, which is very famous, famous recently. But right now, like 90%, more than 90% front end will be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's it. But on the front end side, on the other hand, on the back end side, we mainly focus on how things works using the logic and the data, right? On the front end, there will be no data. The data will be dynamic. It's all the data will come from the backend side. And the logic on the front end, there will be a lot of logic, but those kind of logic are like the UI or UX logic. There's no data logic at all. And on the backend side, we design how things work. We use RV node. Actually, it's just a command argument, command line argument. We don't use it in our code that often. So on the backend side, we focus a lot on the logic. On the internet or somewhere you may heard the word business logic or application logic. I prefer to call it application logic rather than business logic, right? The term business logic is very broad. Okay, so we focus on application logic. We focus a lot on the data, right? And to work with the data, we will use another language or another server, another language to manage the data. And right now there are two main data language, which are database language, which are SQL and NoSQL. In this call, you will learn NoSQL, and we will use MongoDB for NoSQL. And to build a backend server or backend application, there are so many languages that support backend application. For example, JavaScript, yes, Ruby, Python, PHP, Java, Golang, Rust, Dino, which just came out this year. So there are so many languages. Why did we choose JavaScript? So we have Ruby, Python, PHP, Java, etc. But we chose JavaScript. Well, there are a couple of reasons. Originally, Code School taught Ruby and Ruby for the backend language. I will answer that. Originally, Code School taught Ruby and used Rails as a framework, and then we switched to Python with Flask. And then recently, we decided to go with Node and Express. Okay, and the main reason is that we want the student to focus on to master language first, right? Which is JavaScript. And then we want the student to focus a lot on the logic, the backend logic, rather than learning a new syntax for new language. Another reason is like JavaScript is very fast, and people usually to build a to reduce the time to develop an app, people usually use the same language for front end, back end. If you want to be a full stack, so the development time will be very fast. And JavaScript is actually very fast comparing to build a web server, comparing to Python. And it's very easy to use for asynchronous tasks because JavaScript is asynchronous, non-locking nature. Basically, you can handle multiple tasks at the same time. And to do that, it's very easy to do that in JavaScript comparing to Python. And there are a couple of big organizations actually move from Java or Python to JavaScript. So even though this is a high-level review detail, but JavaScript, the cons of NodeJS is actually it's not scalable. Like if you have a very huge app application, NodeJS will not be able to handle that. But there's a way around that. So people nowadays decided to make Node app as a microservice. So basically we have a very big app, right? So we divided the task, the smaller tasks into multiple apps, NodeJS app. So that to fix the problem of non-scalable. And right now the demand for NodeJS is very high. From the last two bootcamps, when people graduate, they actually have a lot of interview. Comparing to Python, it's very hard to find a job for if we learn Python in class compared to NodeJS. Okay. Yeah, do you have any other question about JavaScript? Okay. With the newest thing came out, is it gonna replace JavaScript? Which was that? Actually, JavaScript will be here for the next 10 years maybe, because right now every front end, like most of the front end framework, or we use JavaScript. You can count like React, Angular, even though Angular is developing very slowly recently. You also have Vue.js, you have Nest.js, those kind of framework. They use JavaScript, and yeah, JavaScript is not going anywhere soon. So, but for the backend language, if you want to make a very big app, you may have to use another language though. Another question? What is the issue with Python? I thought it's a more powerful language and more user-friendly in terms of syntax. Yeah, the syntax is very user-friendly, and to me, I think Python is the should be the first language to learn. It's very for beginner. It's very easy to learn. But JavaScript, there's a couple of pros of learning JavaScript compared to Python right now, because we learn one language for both back and front end, right? Make it the development process go smoothly, as well as JavaScript can handle asynchronous tasks much better than compared to Python. You just need to use promise on away, async and away. That's it. Python it's much harder to handle multi-threading tasks, and there are only like two frameworks for web server in Python, which is Django and Flask. And usually, when we decided to teach a course, we need to pick a stack. For example, right now we are learning one stack, which is MongoDB. What's the Express JS for the framework, the backend framework, React JS for the front end, and main. What's the end? I forgot end. What's it the end letter for? I don't really remember. NodeJS for the language. So we decide to pick a main stack. Maybe later on we will have another course for Vue.js as well, but who knows? So I try Ruby and I really love it. Yeah, Ruby is very famous a couple of years ago, and right now there's a big demand for experienced developer for Ruby. So right now, new people, they don't want to learn Ruby. So there will be a huge demand for Ruby, senior Ruby. And I think the salary is very high compared to other languages. Okay, enough about that. We will have, using JavaScript, we actually have two, maybe more, but right now I can count two alternatives for JavaScript. First is Flow. Flow is actually using JavaScript as well, but it is another tool that will add type to your JavaScript code when it compiles, right? And actually, there's not much many developers using Flow actually, but TypeScript, talking about TypeScript, there will be a lot of developers using TypeScript right now. And what's the pro and con for TypeScript compared to normal JavaScript? Well, TypeScript is more like it's still JavaScript, but it's more like type restricted, right? So before we define any variable, we also have to define the type for that variable. And it will reduce the error, the bugs during the runtime. But to type the code is it take much longer to type code, less bug when running, but more time to type code. So it's all about trade-off, right? You have to decide. Not so sure though. Flows, yeah, kind of like that will be a tool that will wrap your JavaScript code, give it some type before it actually compiles. I don't actually use Flow. I don't know much about it. Sorry. uh, uh, yeah, but for TypeScript, you can if you look on the look up on the internet, you will see a lot of example, Node.js example, or React example, or Vue.js example code using TypeScript. So don't freak out. Actually, you can use TypeScript in these framework as well, and a lot of people actually use it. So maybe your next level will be learning TypeScript after this. Okay. So that's it about the language. Then we talk about Node.js. Well, JavaScript actually, when it first introduced, it was a language that only runs on the browser, nowhere else, only on the browser, right? Originally, and its main purpose back then was to make the web become more lively. So we give it some like animation, behavior, moving around, so object moving around, something like that. And then a guy came up and developed an engine, no, a runtime environment that will allow JavaScript to run on a server, not just a browser, right? And he called it Node.js. So Node.js is just a JavaScript runtime that allow JavaScript to run on a server, to execute outside of the browser, to run on a server. And Node.js is currently running on the Chrome VA engine, which is the most popular and the fastest one in the market right now, right? And there are a couple of differences between a browser JavaScript and a server-side JavaScript. We will talk about it later or during the course, you'll see. Right. So Node.js is just a JavaScript runtime that allow you to run a multi-platform or cross-platform runtime to allow you to execute JavaScript code outside of the browser, which means on the server side. Okay. So here's the differences between in-browser JavaScript and server JavaScript. So as we learn React, they are kind of like a browser JavaScript, and it will allow us to manipulate the web page, right? Interaction between user and the web page. Also, interaction between the browser and the web server. Can you give me an example for that, Mark? A interaction between the browser and the web server. Hello. Mark. Hello. Wow. Can anyone answer that question? Yeah. Can you give me an example that for the interaction between a web browser and a web server? So here, so anything related to web page manipulation, interaction in the web server. Almost correct. Not really correct, but almost there. What happened? Yeah, what happened after you submit a form, right? You can do a lot of things. You don't have to call an API or anything, right? So interaction between a web page and a web server is that request. You send a GET request, you send a POST request. Yeah, so anything that going between the client or the browser and the server will be, we will call them requests, right? And we have GET request, POST request, put request, path request, delete request, all of them. So example for interaction with the user, interaction between a web page and the user, it will be the form, right? When you submit a form, when you hit enter, what happened inside that, we don't know yet, but usually we will collect the data the input data, and then we decide what to do afterward, right? So it's the interaction between the user and the web page. Maybe when you hit submit, you see a loading icon or something. So those are created by JavaScript, the browser with JavaScript. But the in-browser JavaScript, there will be a lot of restrictions for the user safety, right? For example, when you want to get the location using your browser, the current location of the browser, you may have to ask permission. For example, Chrome will pop up and ask for permission to collect your location. Or if you want to send a notification on the browser, right? It will pop up and ask, do you allow the Chrome to display notification from this website, and etc. There's a lot of things that require user permissions. For example, saving a files. But on the server side, a JavaScript code or a Node application you can read and write the files on your system, as long as that folder is as long as you granted the permission to read and write files inside that folder. You can copy or execute some programs, not all, but some. You don't have, the Node application doesn't have direct access to the system function, right? For example, you cannot just format the whole server by running a Node.js code. For example, you cannot just shut down the whole server using Node.js code. It's just to protect this the system. Okay, so on the server side, if you remember some problem we had before, on the server side, you can actually make a network request without worrying about cost. So you may want to call what call is. It's there on the server side to protect the server, the resource. For example, you don't allow user from a different website to make an API request to your website, right? To your server, just to protect the resource. On the server, on the browser, there's a mechanism to disable, to use call to disable requests like that. But you can call any request on your server without any cost problems. And that's why in your earlier project, I have something called cost everywhere. There's a bucket cost everywhere here, which to actually this cost anywhere here, which is an application to send a request on the server side to get around the cost restriction on the browser. So that's pretty much it. You can stop me anytime if you are not clear on a certain concept. Okay, and then inside Node.js we have a tool called NPM. An NPM is just like a Node package manager. It will allow you to manage your package. For example, you want to install some module or some libraries from npm.js.com. And Node Package Manager NPM was bought by Microsoft like 2 months ago. So I think Microsoft is trying to build a desktop app using JavaScript. It's quite slow. Those kind of app is quite slow. You can tell right away when you run the app. Okay, for the modules, you will have 3 different types of modules. It's not too important, but it's good to know that you will have a core module, community modules, or maybe your own custom module. Right? A core modules is something from the Node.js package, which means you don't have to install it. It's already there. You can just import and use. Or sometimes you don't even have to import it. Just use it. Or sometimes you may need to import it, but you don't have to install at all. It's already inside the Node.js. And for community models, you will have to install them. You may go to this website, npm.js.com, and we will use this website a lot. For example, if you want to install Moment, go and find Moment. Here we go. And we need to install Moment, right? So this is a community model. Where am I? So we need to install them, import them, and then use them. Okay. For custom model, we can define, we can create our model by ourselves. Usually it's going to be some small module that we're going to reuse them over the time for our application. You see this a lot. So question from Mark, there will be like a backend function we would have to import and use. Math is actually is a core module. We don't need to import it. I don't think we need to import it. But Moment is a community module. We need to install it here. Okay. And what else? There's a couple more. For example, validator, we will use this. So this model is community model. It will have you to validate the data. For example, it will check, is it string? Oh my God. Not this one. It will check, for example, it will check for if that string is an email or not. If that string is, okay, there will be a lot of things here. It will check the data for us. Check if the currency. And I think it's fun, it's very useful. Is that string empty? Is that string a float value, or is that an email, something like that, right? It's very cool. And these are community models. Your own model is something that you have kind of like function or class or object that we had to define inside our code, right? And after all, at the end of the day, you need to understand what NodeJS can do and what it cannot do. For example, here, NodeJS can do a lot of things. It can create a package management tool, or it can manage package using NPM. Actually, Bower is also created by Node.js. There's a couple of tools that created by Node.js here. You can see. So basically, you run the tool on a terminal, right? You can develop, create some development tool. For example, Webpack. Webpack is actually something that you create a React app. You can scheduling some tasks, running tasks. For example, at some time of the day, a task will start or end. You can run automatic tasks using run gup here. I forgot what's up here. But you also have a tool called linter. For example, ESLint. It will check your code and recommend some way to fix the error, for example, or give it some warning. So you may have used ESLint before, right? It's actually written using Node.js. And obviously, you can create a backend application with Node.js, right? So that's the purpose of why we are learning Node.js right now. Aside from that, you can also create command line tool for RimGraph. There's a lot of command line tool that using Node.js. For example, RimGraph here is very famous. You may not know about it, but actually it's a tool that will allow you to remove files. Just that's it. But to remove files or folder, it's very hard depending on your system, right? For example, in Windows, you have different command. In Linux, you have different command. Ubuntu different command. No, maybe Linux and Ubuntu the same command. But for Mac OS, yeah, for Mac OS also very different. The command is very different. So RimGraph here is a tool that will detect your OS system and choose the correct command to use. for your Node.js app, right? So inside your Node.js app, you can delete files using one command, and this tool will detect your OS system and decide which command for the output. So very useful. Actually, you can see here, this tool is downloaded like 36 million times in just 1 week, weekly. Yeah. So a lot of applications use this library behind the scenes. You see a lot of libraries like this, like $30 million, $40 million per week. You see them, but you never use them. Okay, you can also build a desktop application with Node.js, right? For example, Discord, I think Discord is built with, not really Node.js, but it's built with something, I just forgot. I forgot which they built Slack, Discord, and some other stuff with some a framework, not Express, some other framework, but they still use run on Node.js. I just forgot the name. My memory is very bad. So the cause of those kind of app is they are very buggy. For sometimes you have to hit Command R to reload the app, even though it's a desktop app, right? You can hit Command R to reload the app. For example, on Discord or on Slack, you can do that. And some other tool, they also use Node.js application to build it. The pro is, there's another IDE that use a JavaScript to build, which is Atom. Atom is another IDE. Yeah, it's kind of like VS Code. I don't know if anyone actually. It's written using Electron. Electron is just a framework. Okay, you can do a lot of things using JavaScript. So if you master JavaScript, there are a lot of like chance job opportunity out there. You can build a desktop app, you can be web app, you can be a backend developer, you can be a master in front end. Yeah, Item is kind of hard to use. And there's a pro and cons from Item and not VS Code. I personally don't use Item though. I hate it. Okay, before we recap everything, let's take a look at a couple of projects in this module. So we will learn how to build a good old to-do app using the terminal, right? Command lines like this. And then we will learn how to build some kind of like a weather app on the server side. So you already do this on the front end, right? You call an API on the front end, but this time we're gonna call an API on the backend side and send the data to the front end. Okay. And then we will build a meme maker using Node.js. But this time we're gonna connect, we will combine React and for the front end and Node.js for the backend side. So you will not forget about React. So one problem I heard from previous class was they forgot everything about React after they learned the backend module. So this time we decided to still keep you guys engaged with React during the backend module, so that you don't forget everything. And then for the next week, we're gonna build the block API, the block server API, just something very similar to what I had done for you guys last week, which is this here. We will learn how to use Postman, organize Postman, and also build the APIs here. So we have a bunch of APIs. We will learn how to create them eventually throughout the week 8, and then in week 9, we will learn more about the advanced stuff. For example, there are a couple of APIs here, which is advanced. For example, reactions. For reaction, I only have one API, but actually it's a lot of things for you. So eventually we will learn all of them in week 8 and 9. And then week 10, you will on week 8, we will have a weekly project, which requires you to build the backend and the front end together. And we don't have the example for those projects yet, but just keep in mind. On week 10, we will learn some extra stuff. For example, if you want to learn about, it depends on what you want to learn on week 10. For example, you can learn a lot of concept about user authentication between front end and back end. You can learn more about refresh token if you want. You can learn about the payment service if you want, as well as a geolocation queries. So there are a lot of things we can learn, extra stuff we can learn on week 10, depending on our progress during week 8 and 9. Then we will decide which one we are gonna do next, right? So one of the problem for previous bootcamp was that there were too many information, too many concepts that was introduced, and some of them was not needed, depending on the final project. Okay, so we decided we tend to be like on demand. So here's this week for weekly project. I really like this, the meme maker. Yeah, it's very fun, and actually you can use this one to showcase what you have done in the backend side or on the front end side. It's it's a cool project to be inside your portfolio. So make sure you slide beautifully, right? There are a lot of things we can learn. We will learn when we are making this app. Okay. Today lab is very. It's not simple. It's the first step in our journey, and we will create our first application that we run outside the browser. Right. Up until now, you do everything using a browser. Any application you have built will run on the browser, but this time it will run outside of the browser. And actually, starting from today, we're going to build app that run outside of the browser as well. For example, the API server. Usually, you will not use any browser to check the results, but you use Postman to check the results, to check the errors, right? So that's the end of the lecture this morning. Do you have any question? I know I've been talking to myself quite a lot, but yeah, now it's your time. And I've lectured until what? Nah, it's actually it's on the theory is done. Before I need to recap the main point for today. Differentiation between front end and back end. This is the most important thing you need to know today, right? So on the front end, we focus, there will be logic, right? There will be logic and data, but the logic on the front end only serve the UI, the UX, right, on the browser. And on the front end, you only focus on how things looks, how the user will see your website, how things will be displayed, how things will be organized on the UI. And then what happened when the user send a ticket, purchase a ticket? The front end doesn't know anything, right? It's all decided by the back end. It's all designed by the back end, and the front end will only receive the data, the result from the back end side. It doesn't know how stuff was doing. Just like from yesterday, I talked about abstraction, right? Front end only knows that, okay, when a user buy a ticket, he expects to receive the code in return, right? But the front end doesn't know what happened at all on the back end side. So Front end we have we deal with a lot of images, render images, position the images, or the content or the structure of the site. Sometimes the backend can control these things. For example, it can control where the image will be displayed on the web, on the browser, on the web page. For example, depending on your logic, you want to display the content in the middle of the screen or on the left or on the right. Sometimes it can be controlled by the backend side as well. And on the front end, right now we only have 3 languages, which are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Nothing else. That's it. Very simple. But on the backend side, you have a lot of options. Right? You have JavaScript. You can use JavaScript to do that. You can use Ruby to do that. You can use Python. You can use PHP. You can use Golang, Java, other languages that support backend server. And you also have to decide which database you will use. For example, you could use SQL, which is MySQL, Postgres, SQLite if you want, or sometimes Oracle. Or you can use NoSQL, which the most famous database for NoSQL right now is MongoDB, which we will learn later in the course. Okay. There's a big difference between NoSQL and SQL, though we will talk about it later. So the backend side, we focus the logic on the server side. For example, what happened when the user want to register an account, right? They send us a username, they send an email and password. What happened afterwards? How do we store the data? How do we process the data to decide whether the password is correct, whether the email is duplicated or not? Those kind of logic will be handled by the backend side. And how we store the data is another different story. Where we store it, how we store it, and how we would use the data later on. So those kind of logic will be handled in the backend side, which we will learn next week. Okay, what else? What's the main 3 things? The basic syntax, this you learn during the lab, don't worry. What you can do with NodeJS, a lot of things. A lot of things. Where is it? Oh, what it cannot do? Well, it cannot just format your system, right? So basically, things outside of this you cannot do with Node.js. For example, you may not be able to control another computer using Node.js without permission, for example. Right? I had learned Ruby 2 years ago and I don't remember anything. Yeah, just like I actually code a lot of Flash using Python Flash. And then after just 3 months, I have never touched Python, and now I forget everything about running a Flash server. But that's okay. We know how to Google, man. It's fine. We don't remember everything, right? We just know how to use them, and then when we get back to it, just Google how things work, the syntax, and then we use it. Yeah. Yeah. Imagine if Stack Overflow is down. Okay. Do you have any other questions? Before we take a break, a short break, and then we will do the, I will walk you through the first 1, 2, 3 milestone. First 2 milestone. Wow, 12 years ago. Do you have any other questions? No. Okay. So let's get back at 11 sharp, so we can have like more than half an hour to walk through the first 3 milestones. Okay. learning these command lines is very useful in the future because you know exactly what happened when you type something like this. Okay, see you guys. I will have to leave this meeting to record, to upload the video. Okay, see ya. What? Where is Zoom? Wait, I cannot close Zoom. Oh, sorry.